Okay, I think we're ready to get started. Welcome to today's Logz.io webinar, where we will be discussing data security generally and logging securely in particular. My name is Mike Neville O'Neill. I am the lead customer success engineer at Logz.io. My professional interests are primarily in DevOps and information security. I spent a good amount of time at Logz.io. Before I was here, I was working for a company called Rapid7, configuring and deploying SIEMs, and I spent the last 5 or 6 years in log management or InfoSec. So I'm looking forward to this presentation or conversation that we'll have today. In terms of an agenda, I want to start off with some foundational principles about information security and some of the frameworks that you can look to for guidance on how to improve your security posture. And then we'll spend a good bit of time talking about kind of identifying and classifying your data to get an understanding of what data is most important or mission critical to your business and how to select the relevant security controls for that data depending on its level of sensitivity or importance. We'll also talk a little bit about continuous monitoring and the role that plays in both what one might think of as true security and regulatory compliance. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions at the end. If you do have any questions, please feel free to submit those in the chat box, and I'll try to get to as many as I can before we run out of time today. So if you are a current Logz.io customer, I do want to bring to your attention that there are a few resources that you can access to get assistance and support. The fastest route is almost always through the intercom chat icon, which is located in the lower right area of the Logz.io web UI. That will connect you to our support engineers who are working 24/7. Everybody is a full-time employee of Logz.io. We don't outsource or offshore. It's also the case that if you prefer to work over email, you can raise a ticket by sending an email to help@logz.io. And we also offer ample self-support resources on our documents page. In addition, we offer the Logz.io Academy, which is included in every trial and subscription to Logz.io, which is a self-service learning platform that contains things like webinars, ebooks, how-to guides, and onboarding materials. So if you're left wanting more after this webinar, you're interested in learning more about Logz.io, I definitely recommend checking out the Academy. So to begin, I want to talk a little bit about some of the security frameworks and principles that have informed this presentation and that folks tend to rely on out in the wild, so to speak. For me personally, I tend to lean heavily on NIST. A big part of that has to do with the fact that I'm an American, and that's how we tend to be trained from a security perspective. But even though it is an American organization, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, there's still a lot of useful general information in terms of definitions of security terms, as well as recommendations for controls and strategies, policies, guidelines, and procedures. So I still think it's worth having a look at that NIST cybersecurity framework, even if you are not an American or your business is not subject to American regulations. There are a host of other sources you can consult as well, including ENISA, which is the European Union equivalent of NIST, as well as ISO 27002, which actually outlines the controls and control mechanisms that you would need to implement in order to be compliant with ISO 27001. That is unfortunately a paid resource, but it is worth noting if that's something that you're interested in achieving for your organization. I'm also a really big fan of the Center for Internet Security, or CIS, and what that resource will provide is roughly over 100 different kind of control guidelines for a number of different data sources, systems, and applications. So for example, if you are hosted in AWS, you can take a look at a CIS benchmark for IAM monitoring, and it will say specifically which types of CloudTrail events you'd want to alert on in order to meet their standards for security. And this is relatively unbiased, neutral. It's not really focusing on a specific region or country. So I definitely recommend as you start this journey and you start trying to determine which security controls to align with data types in your environment, that you take a look at this to get a sense of what best practices look like. Because when we talk about best practices, they're somewhat informed by consensus of the community, but that consensus is largely built on the frameworks and principles that you'll be able to find from these resources. I also want to talk a little bit about a particular security framework or model, which is the CIA triad. If you are or have been in InfoSec, this is probably really familiar to you. And it essentially is a three-legged stool, which insists that security is dependent on the maintenance of confidentiality, integrity, and availability. Where confidentiality is the unauthorized disclosure of information, and that could be to internal or external parties, whether that's an external threat or an internal user who has access to information that they should not be authorized to access. Integrity is going to track the modification of data in your environment, whether that's destruction or simply a read. And for availability, I think that'll be pretty straightforward from an operations perspective. It's simply disruption of access to or use of an information or information system. And this is going to come up a little bit later when we talk about how you can build kind of a very simple risk matrix for your data types. We'll also be relying on the idea of least privilege throughout, which is the notion that users should be granted the minimum amount of access required to do their jobs. So pretty straightforward there. So I want to start by talking about how you can identify and classify your data, since that's a challenge that I see a lot of our customers running into, is simply being aware of what data exists in your environment and then understanding the sensitivity of that data and determining what controls to apply to it. So that process looks like what you see here, which is really a synthesis of a number of different approaches recommended by NIST, by AWS, and all of them differ slightly, but they do tend to follow what you see here, which is a process of identifying the data in your environment, assessing that data, understanding and classifying the sensitivity, and then selecting the controls to apply to that data, validating that they work as expected and that the security controls that you have selected are appropriate for the given source and sensitivity level. And then lastly, you'll need to continuously monitor your environment to track any changes that might compromise your security posture or take your systems or applications out of compliance. So let's talk a little bit about identification and kind of the idea behind data classification. As I mentioned before, what you're just trying to get a sense of is what types of data exist in your environment. Are you dealing with Apache access logs, system logs? Are there databases containing sensitive information in the environment? Really just doing an inventory of all the data that you're responsible for as a data custodian or a security professional. And then identifying the sensitivity level of that data and the impact on the business of the potential disclosure, alteration, or destruction. And it always comes back to that when you're trying to assess the sensitivity level of a given type of data, is what we're always thinking of is what is the impact on the business if the worst case scenario ends up coming true. So in terms of recommendations for identifying your data and kind of taking an inventory, the first thing that you'll want to do is define your objectives to understand what the goal of this classification is and what you're hoping to achieve at the end state. It might be the case that you're just looking to improve your security posture generally, or maybe there are specific regulatory compliances that you need to adhere to, or maybe they're just a set of guidelines you want to adhere to as well. So you need to understand what it is you're trying to craft your security policy, as it were, to achieve. The next step, as we've discussed, is to define the categories and types of data. And then you need to define your data use cases and desired outcomes. So one outcome might be that you're able to pass an audit for PCI, excuse me. Another might be that you're simply looking to improve the security for a given system. And when you're trying to define those use cases and giving some thought to how your data will be used, it's important to think about that data as it traverses the data lifecycle. That the responsibility that you have as a data custodian or data owner doesn't typically end after the first stage of that data. You'll need to make sure that it's secure throughout the lifecycle. So from a log management perspective, that means ensuring that the data is encrypted both in transit, that you're shipping data either internally or to a third-party aggregator over TLS, and that however you're storing that data, that it should be encrypted at rest and ideally using full disk encryption. The next step in the process is to assess the data that you have and to try to assign a level of sensitivity to it. What one approach might look like is adopting a three-tier data classification scheme. where you can assign 3 levels of sensitivity to that data based on the impact to the business, as you see spelled out here. This is something that, as you can imagine, is going to be very specific to your organization. And it's why during this webinar today, I'm not going to spend too much time on hands-on technical implementation, because the level of sensitivity that should be assigned to a given data set and the appropriate security controls are going to depend very heavily on individual use cases, your organization, and its business goals. So you can see that these sensitivity levels are kind of squishy. They're not quantitative. They're based on kind of your understanding of the impact of an adverse event or security incident or event on your business. That's not to say that you couldn't conduct a more sophisticated risk analysis that might involve some quantitative data, but for now, we're going to keep it pretty simple and just stick to these qualitative tiers that you see here. So what I've built out here is just an example of a 3-tiered risk matrix that you could construct after you've done an inventory of your data types. You can see across the top row, we've got confidentiality, integrity, and availability, as well as the high watermark. So what does high watermark mean? Essentially, it's the notion that what you'd like to do when assigning a sensitivity level to your data is you take the highest level of sensitivity in any of these given categories, confidentiality, integrity, or availability, and it's that level that's going to constitute the high watermark, which will ultimately determine the type of security control that you'll need to implement. The idea being that if any one of these categories is higher than any of the others, you need to ensure that that particular use case, that particular scenario is covered. So to look at the Apache access logs, for example, maybe for a particular organization, they don't contain any sensitive information. So in that case, the impact on the business would be relatively low were that data to be disclosed. Integrity, maybe it's the case that data is used for reporting, either for marketing or performance reasons. So there'd be a moderate impact on the business if that data was not reliable or if it was modified in some way. And the same would be true for availability. So we've got low and moderate for a couple of the other categories, which leads to a high watermark value of moderate. And the same is true for those other 2 sources that you see there, where we're focusing here primarily on information, but if you were to perform an actual assessment involving a risk matrix, you of course would want to take into account the underlying infrastructure and assets as well. So this can be really helpful as you start or continue your journey on the path of improving your security posture, just to get an understanding of what data exists and what does it mean to your business and how would it impact it if any of these adverse events were to occur. You can then use that high watermark to determine the level of investment you would put in a particular security control or type of security control. Obviously, it's not possible or even desirable to apply the highest level of security to each and every data type or asset that's in your environment. So you do need to put some effort in or an investment up front in figuring out where to apply your security controls or the most stringent security controls in order to ensure that you're getting the most bang for your security buck, so to speak. The process of selecting security controls can be somewhat daunting. What we're looking at here is a diagram that shows the traditional defense in depth model. If you're not familiar with the concept of defense in depth, essentially it's just an information assurance concept in which multiple layers of security controls are placed throughout an information technology system. Maybe 5 or 10 years ago, the prevailing thought was that if you built a big enough wall around your environment, you'd be able to keep attackers from accessing it. I think that thinking has changed very much in the sense that common knowledge now dictates that at some point an attacker is going to get into your environment, that it's essentially a foregone conclusion. So the goal then is not to prevent any type of intrusion in the environment or on the network, but simply to slow, delay, and impede the attacker as much as possible, so that if your initial security layer fails, you have some backup security layers that may foil a potential attacker. And that's what you see here. Where at the perimeter, for example, you'd have your firewalls, your IDS, IPS, and then you'd have different layers of controls as you get closer and closer to the data itself. So there's a number of security controls that you can select depending on the sensitivity level of your data. Unsurprisingly, there are a lot of paid solutions that will meet that need for you, but it's also the case that there are a large number of open source security tools that you can leverage in order to secure your environment. And in this case, I tried to get an image to load here, but it just wasn't working quite the way that I had expected. So I actually want to take a look at the website here itself. I don't take credit for this. This was created by a gentleman, Adrian Griroff. And what I like about this is that it actually maps the specific security controls to a number of open source tools that will help you implement that control or meet that need. So this can be really helpful if you're relatively new to security, or maybe you are committed to using open source tools. This is comprehensive, and each one of these links for a given open source tool will actually take you to that tool's website. So I'm going to include a link to this in the presentation, which will be delivered after we're wrapped up today. So I strongly suggest that once you have completed that risk metrics and that identification and inventory of your data, that you have a look at this and see if there's anything that you could potentially implement that's specifically targeted at that data source or use case. And then we'll talk a little bit about the idea of monitoring, which is pretty much required by every regulatory framework that exists, whether you're talking about PCI, HIPAA, GDPR. There is typically some requirement that at minimum, you're centralizing your data and you're monitoring it at regular intervals. The objectives from a monitoring perspective in terms of securing your data is to confirm that the security controls that you've implemented are actually effective in their current state. This is also somewhat of the validation phase, where it's a QA process during which you would ensure that what you've implemented works as expected. If you have somebody more senior in the organization, someone like a CISO or a high-level business owner, probably makes sense to run this by them to ensure you get their buy-in and that you're not missing anything from a security perspective. It's also the case that any monitoring tool or strategy that you would employ should be designed to track the effectiveness of security controls as your environment changes. As you know, most environments are not static. They're very dynamic and things are changing all the time. So you can implement a set of security controls and maybe a month or two later, you actually end up being out of compliance because of changes that have been made over time. So an effective monitoring strategy or solution can make that significantly easier. Lastly, you'll want the ability to easily provide reports to be consumed by business owners, auditors, peers, business stakeholders in a given project. That's generally going to make your job a lot easier, and it's going to make it much easier to understand kind of the state of your security posture from an at-a-glance report. There's a number of tools that you could potentially use to accomplish the monitoring objectives that were outlined previously. Most commonly, what we see in the security space is the Security Information and Event Management Tool, otherwise known as a SIEM, sometimes pronounced SIEM. The requirements for a tool to be considered a SIEM are that it needs to analyze your data in real time, and it's typically log-driven, but not necessarily so. It can ingest metrics like network telemetry, for example. And the primary goal of a SIEM tool is to detect targeted attacks, security events, and incidents, such as data breaches. And lastly, you'll need the ability to collect, analyze, store, investigate, and report on that log data for myriad use cases that are related to security investigation. I think it can be very handy both in terms of investigating and identifying a potential incident before remediation, but it can also be really useful for constructing lessons learned reports, which in terms of incident response is often overlooked. That once the breach has been contained and remediated, oftentimes folks will move on to the next project, but lessons learned is probably the most valuable part of the incident response process. We're able to learn from vulnerabilities that previously existed and mistakes that may have been made, and improve your processes and security posture going forward. So we'll talk a little bit about the Logz.io security module, which is one way you can meet this need. I'm sure you're not surprised to see this come up in a presentation by Logz.io, but this isn't the only option that you have, obviously. There are a lot of big players in this space, tools like IBM QRadar, HP ArcSight, Dell SecureWorks, and many, many others. Essentially, the goal would be to use a tool like security analytics as part of that defense in depth. where you're integrating it with your threat prevention tools and data sources, as well as your incident response workflow or process. Essentially, what we're providing is a single place to investigate those logs and find new threats. If you are looking for a SIM, one of the biggest components is that it usually comes packaged with a series of predefined rules that are focusing on very common security events or incidents, so those can be surfaced and brought to your attention. That's one aspect of what the Logz.io security module can do, but it's also the case that it can perform some automated correlation of external IPs that are present in your logs with known malicious IPs that are captured from the external feeds that you see listed here, including alien vault emerging threats, abuse.ch, and many others. You'll also see that there's some content packages focusing on specific data types and security controls. For example, if you're not familiar with Wazoo, it is a fork of OSSEC. So it's primarily a host-based intrusion detection system, but it's also the case that it can serve as a file integrity monitor. So it can let you know if those files that you have deemed as being a high risk from a sensitivity perspective within the context of integrity, Wazoo can keep you informed on the changes that are made to your files and then aggregate them so that they're stored kind of separate from that given system so you can review them at a later date. So I'd like to open it up to questions. I'll take a look at the chat at this point and see whether you guys have any questions about what we have reviewed so far. So now is a good time to chime in. Okay, I'm not seeing any questions so far. I do hope that this information was useful for you as kind of a high-level primer on some steps you can take a look at what you're logging today, what you're working with in terms of data, and how you can adopt and consult a framework to classify that data and then adopt security controls to ensure that you're maintaining that confidentiality, integrity, and availability. That's just one model that you could potentially use. The reason that I chose it for this particular presentation is because the CIA triad is a very opinionated model. And it really emphasizes the protection of data, which was the subject of the presentation today. I'll stay on the line here for a few minutes in case you guys have any questions. And if not, thank you very much for joining, and I hope you have a wonderful rest of your week. Okay, I do see a few questions coming in. We will talk a little bit about, or we will distribute the slide deck that was used in the presentation so that you guys can get the contained list of sources. We also got a question about whether we provide SaaS or just the app and real-time text monitoring logs after implementation. So Logz.io is a 100% SaaS solution. We can ingest logs in pretty much any format or metrics, and you end up shipping them from your environment over to ours in real time. So that's typically how that works. Hopefully that addressed those two questions. I did see a question come in as to whether we have any filter settings for PII built into the tool. So I would say that there's nothing built in specifically to filter against PII, but that is something that we could set up for you on our side. One of the things that Logz.io has the ability to offer is what we refer to as parsing as a service. So we actually built an open source JSON transformation library called Sawmill. And I'm going to pull that up for you guys in just a moment so you can take a look at the documentation. However, one of the things that we can do with that transformation layer is potentially scrub sensitive information before it is indexed in your Elasticsearch instance. The only thing to be aware of is that at that point, the sensitive data has already left your environment and probably constitutes some type of disclosure. So what I would usually recommend is that you take a look at the shipper and try to filter it out client side. There's no shortage of regular expressions that can be found online that will correspond to very common types of PII. For those of you who are not familiar with that term, that's personally identifying information. So that's things like names, email addresses, physical addresses, credit card numbers, social security numbers, and much, much more. So my recommendation would be to try and implement some of those filters client side so that the information never leaves your environment. I'm just seeing if we got any more questions here. So we did get a question about configuration and implementation, whether it's something that would be on the customer side or is it something that we would help with from an assistance perspective? And if not, are there vendors or partners that can help out with that? That's a good question. And the answer is that yes, we would help you with configuration and implementation, which is relatively lightweight as there's nothing that you need to run on premise on our side in terms of infrastructure. You simply need to find a way to ship that data to our listeners that are cloud-based. Every customer at Logz.io has the ability or is entitled to participating in an onboarding process. And part of that process, both pre-sales and post-sales, is ensuring that the tool is configured correctly, that you have the data sources that you need shipped into the tool, and also to ensure that your data is parsed out properly so that it's valuable for you. We can also assist with the creation of alerts, dashboards, and anything else that you need. So typically we're pretty hands-on with configuration and implementation. It's not the case that we can do that for you, but we can work with you very closely to make that process as painless as possible. From a partner standpoint, I'm not aware of anyone we're partnering with to deploy or implement Logz.io, but I can have a chat with our VP of partnerships and see if I'm mistaken on that point or if we have anything coming in the near term. And there was a question about whether we interface with third-party software firms in our solution. And if so, how do we ensure the total solution cannot be compromised? So I may not completely understand this question. In the sense of do we interface with third-party software firms? We do not. All of our development is done in-house by full-time Logz.io employees. It's not the case that we employ contractors in any capacity in your data. is not going to be shared with anyone outside of the organization, and indeed wouldn't be shared even within the organization. From a security perspective, we do have a SOC 2 Type 2 report that we can provide under NDA. We're also ISO 27001 certified. I believe we're HIPAA compliant and GDPR compliant as well. So if there are concerns with our data security practices, there are a number of deliverables that we can provide to help address those concerns. And we also got a question about kind of how does behavioral analysis work, or do we have that? And if so, how can you be notified? So that's an interesting question. I can say directly that no, we don't have what you would traditionally think of as a UBA offering. It's not the case that we would be building profiles of behavior baselines for individual users and then being able to automatically identify deviations from that baseline. But what we do have are a series of pre-built rules, as well as that threat enrichment, the automated detection of malicious known IPs in your data. And it's also the case that we have a machine learning driven feature called Insights, which is designed to automatically surface key events, errors, and exceptions in your environment. So for example, I can show you on product what it looks like in the operations view today. It's something that we're hoping to bring to the security product, and it's a work in progress. But I can show you here. This is what the Insights page looks like in the operations view. And what you'll see is a series of events that were surfaced automatically by Logz.io. There's no requirement here to tune or configure the rules. It's something that's simply going to work out of the box once you start to send in different types of data. We have two types of insights, application insights and cognitive insights. I think for the purposes of our discussion, cognitive insights is really what you'd be interested in, since application insights is really focusing much more on just capturing application exceptions. So we'll take a look at an example of what is ostensibly a security event, which would be a possible shell exploit attempt. So this is something that we have the ability to surface automatically today. We'll populate this insight with a link to a reputable source or technical forum. So in this case, SANS, but in many other cases, we'll be looking at Stack Overflow, GitHub, and many other sources. And all of this is fully customizable, where you can dive into the individual insight, edit the description, edit the reference links. So if you wanted to add a link to an internal knowledge base or Confluence, you'd have the ability to do that, or change the description to a playbook, a series of instructions on what to do if this insight ends up being surfaced. There's also a bit of lightweight workflow management involved, where you do have the ability to assign insights to individual users in your account, and you can also manage the status of a given insight. In addition to being able to look at this high-level information, it's really easy to go into the underlying event itself that triggered that insight. And here in the request field, we can see what looks a little bit strange and pretty consistent with an attempt to exploit the shell. And if we want to take a look at the relevant SANS documentation, it will take you directly to it, describe the nature of that particular event or incident. And there's also some instructions here on how you can potentially mitigate against these types of attacks, as well as remediate anything that's actually ongoing in the environment. So hopefully that addresses the question that I received around behavioral analysis. The next question is, do we have a data scrubbing tool recommendation that could be invoked before the data is sent to your app? If possible, I would try to do it in the same tool that you're using to ship the data. For example, if we take a look at FileBeat, it's very much configurable and it has a number of processors that will allow you to either obfuscate particular strings or drop entire events that contain a match. FileBeat would be our preferred method of shipping data. It's certainly not the only way that you could do it. You could accomplish the same thing with our syslog, for example. But I would recommend using that as your combination data scrubbing tool as well as a shipper. There are probably specific and dedicated products that will actually look through your data for sensitive information. and categorize it. I want to say that Varonis is probably a big player in that space, but obviously that's not free. So if you're just looking to scrub on a pattern matching level, I would recommend FileBeat. Okay, again, I'll stay on the line for a few minutes in case there are any other questions. Okay, I think this is probably a good place to wrap. Again, thanks very much for taking the time to attend. If you do have additional questions or you're interested in learning more about security analytics, I invite you to send an email to help@Logz.io or use the in-app chat, and you'll be connected with an account manager who can talk to you more about whether it's something that might potentially meet your requirements. Again, thanks very much, and check your email in the coming days for the recording of this session as well as the presentation that was delivered. Thanks again.